Първо, искаме да благодарим на Френския културен институт за организацията, за чудесното събитие, което направи връзки много и полезни, позволи ни да обменим перспективи и гледни точки и смятам, че е изключително навременно в ситуацията, в която живеем. Сега започваме нашата презентация. Тя ще бъде двойна и ще бъде на тема противоречивото наследство. Противоречивото наследство е термин, развит в англосаксонския свят след средата на 90-те, което е причината ние да превключим сега на английски. So, hello, my name is Aneta and this is Emilia, and we will start this panel with the topic of contestation. Our joint presentation will address various issues coded in its headline. First, what exactly qualifies as contested heritage today? In a post-war world, in a post-war world, in a post-2020 world, in present-day Europe, keeping in mind all political, social, and cultural factors which make this Europe quite different from a Europe even 10 years ago. Then how can we place the heritage of post-war architecture and its looming conflicts within this context? And finally, what are the urgent questions to be asked when discussing recognized and unrecognized heritage sites? We live in an increasingly fraught world, divided world, where religious, ethnic, national, political, and other groups appropriate, use, misuse, exclude, erase, seek justice of makers and manifestations of their own and others' cultural heritage as a means of asserting, defending, or defying critical claims to power, land, legitimacy, and so forth. Attention to contested cultural heritage is fundamentally awareness of the construction of identity and its strategic uses. The knowledge that self and society are not just given as a fully formed, fixed, and timeless issues. Rather, self and society are always in production, in process. The 1990s made a difference, a gap, and there has been a distinct shift towards a socially engaged, politically aware study of the past that regards heritage as contested, recognizes the role of power in the construction of history, and focuses on production of identity, and preferentially analyzes formerly colonial states and societies, but also areas with looming conflicts like the war after the collapse of former Yugoslavia, areas of religious when war conflicts in the Middle and Far East or the Global South, and more recently, the ex-socialist states of the Second World during the Cold War, of course. I'm certain that Ukraine is quickly falling into this category as of now. So how do we define contested heritage today? The concept of dissonant heritage was introduced to the academic scene in 1996, as I already mentioned, by John Turnbridge and Gregory Ashworth, who used this term to address the conflicting nature of heritage, which arises when different actors attribute contested meanings and values to the past. So they form also contested interpretations of the past, and thus create dissonance and challenges to the dominant perception of heritage as connected to comfortable, harmonious, and consensual views about the meaning of the past. Turnbridge and Ashworth make an important distinction between past as what has happened, history as selective attempts to describe this past, and heritage as a contemporary product shaped from history, which is created through the process of selection and interpretation. This distinction recognizes that dissonance is created each time something is named or selected as heritage, since the interpretive process of heritage making will increasingly incorporate some understanding, meaning, and point of view, but also ignore or disinherit the others. And let us not forget, according to the UNESCO World Heritage Convention from 1972, cultural heritage is generally accepted as bearing universal value, outstanding universal value, in fact, for the World Heritage Sites. It's key for the development of human civilization and is connected to primary values and primary rights, the right to heritage, basic human right. Yet there are cultural areas where we fail to reach mutual understanding. On the contrary, neutral acceptance is non-existent and social unrest prevails. These are the areas where the so-called contested heritage claims its presence. Contested heritage is presumably, well, it is always accompanied by a conflict, or many conflicts overlapping and creating chaos in definitions. In this case, we usually have one or all or some of the following circumstances. We have different assessment of cultural values. We have problems defining social significance. We have refusal for acceptance as heritage of some sites, or refusal for acceptance as worth existing at all, let alone worth preserving. So, lack of objectivity when assessing this type of heritage is one of its main companions, the other strong emotions, which means that even if subjected to the standard heritage assessment criteria and passing the test for value definition and preservation necessity, the underlying conflicts annihilate all of these usually strong instruments for objectivization. So to put it plainly, contested heritage is the perfect instrument to use the past as a weapon in the present. So far, we can outline several clusters of preconditions: political, cultural, social, economic, aesthetic, ecological, and their number seems to be growing. First, we have, of course, the political contestation. There is no way we can do without it. The heritage of Nazism, for example, is contested heritage par excellence, but staying only there is simplifying the matter. Of course, all regimes which have committed crimes against humanity have produced their share of contested heritage, dissonant heritage. Their very existence has shaken the foundations of human civilization. So here we include all kinds of politically burdened heritage, and of course, the heritage of totalitarianisms of the 20th century. All material traces from the past, which still ignite historical discussions, and when such lack of consensus is actively used for political purposes in the present as well. The world has to remember the horrors of the 20th century indeed, and needs its politically dissonant heritage: labor camps, totalitarian monuments, fascist stadiums, Stalinist boulevards, and skyscrapers, and so on, to remind people of these horrors. Presently, however, we continue producing more and more multi-layered political contestation. And the devastating war in Ukraine has turned the memories of the Cold War in yet another battlefield. Political contestation is almost always connected to memory problems and issues of self-identification. Therefore, the cultural aspect here is powerful and inescapable. Particularly affected are historical periods and events that are still the subject of cultural wars and memory battles. This, for example, is the defaced statue of Leopold II in Belgium in 2020, known for his atrocities in Belgian Congo. Let us not forget the pressing issue with monuments, which had another momentum when statues connected with colonialism and racism started falling around the world in 2020, the so-called statue wars. Experts tend to define this heritage in many ways, as dark, inconvenient, shameful, but still as heritage. Its preservation is important, difficult, hard to explain, easy to mislead, and it is impossible without active public talk and serious interdisciplinary efforts. This, for example, is the notorious statue of General Lee in Virginia. Then we have the socially and economically contested heritage. Here, undoubtedly, fall all the utopian efforts of modernism, especially post-war modernism, to make lives better and people happier. Gradually, utopian ideas crumbled, and with them the buildings they have created. As of present, there is no public consensus on their positive social role. Many of them are ghettoized, poorly aging, difficult, and expensive to maintain, with constantly changing social profile of their population. Here we can include post-war housing projects, prefabs, microrayons. A Bulgarian example of such failed utopian heritage is the fate of our modernist seaside resorts, which we heard beautifully explained in the talk of Professor Todor Krstev, completely transformed by the post-socialist realities. Or the notorious drugs and crime residential neighborhood of Sofia, Zone B5, which you see in the picture. The question is that no matter whether we are talking about brutalist blocks, East European panelki, or the residential towers of the Western welfare state, they all embody the presently contested traces of post-war mass modernization. Here, architectural contestation is closely linked to contemporary economic interests, new and cheaper construction, appetites for increased density and thus profits, privatization of large public areas and social housing terrains, free market-based solution to housing crisis. We can also define aesthetically contested heritage, which for one reason or other has been habitually defined as ugly. This category also varies, depending on the cultural climate of each period, of different historic periods, and with the time has included or excluded pre-war architectural traditions, bourgeoisie architectural eclecticism, modernist endeavors, and the egalitarian efforts, of course, of post-war art and architecture. For example, the love and hate relationship of society with bare concrete, and the never-ending story with appreciation of brutalism. Here we can also add a number of urgent problems which undoubtedly reflect on cultural heritage debates. For example, how do we preserve and conserve bare concrete today in a situation of climate crisis? Concrete accounts for the largest part of carbon emissions of construction industry. What would be the environmental effect of a number of buildings which are symbols of 20th century architecture? Will they remain relics from a long forgotten era where it was still allowed to build with non-ecological materials such as concrete? Beyond pure examples, it is very often for a contested object to be associated with more than one, and often with all basic groups I have so far outlined, and which, as I already taught, are constantly expanding. It can be politically burdened and subject subjected to contemporary populism. It can be expensive and hard to maintain, may be subjected to a number of investment interests, may reside in various stages of dereliction and self-devastation, and may be habitually defined as ugly. In Bulgaria, politically burdened contestation was strongest in the 90s, but has lost its sharpness in recent decades. More and more often, the political is intertwined with various and far more complicated cultural, identification, or economic problems of the contemporary Bulgarian society, which are becoming more and more distant from the old dramas of the Cold War and the transition period, and far more connected with our shared European identity today. Thus, the legacy of the grand construction efforts of socialism can be a starting point, but it will have to be enriched with wider scope and in various contexts also covering different cultural situations. For example, the contested heritage of postmodernism, pop culture and kitsch. Is this heritage or is it not? The heritage of post-socialist architecture and the 90s. What are we doing with the transition period? Contemporary problems of identity and self-identification. Pressing issues of diversity and inclusion, cultural colonialization, appropriation, and self-colonization, and so on. Working out heritage is possible, even contested heritage, through a diversity of approaches, such as destruction, oblivion, ignorance, creating consensus, negotiating compromise, or presenting a pluralism of interpretation by a diversity of actors. Approaches beyond ignorance and beyond destruction and violence can allow us to face different perspectives, try to understand them, reconsider our position, and possibly construct new understandings of reality. Are they possible in a present-day divided societies? Well, this is another question for another time. This famous graffiti stood at the entrance of Buzluđa Monument, Bulgaria, till the mid-2010s, and it told many stories about memory, identity, the past, and the present. Later, the graffiti was painted over and then rewritten as a much more direct message, missing the subtlety of the original one. In the autumn of 2021, Buzluđa was listed as a national monument by the Bulgarian Ministry of Culture. Cultural heritage is said to need public consensus so as to be preserved successfully. However, contested heritage is strongly disputable, but there lies its prime cultural value. And that's the advantage of sites such as Buzluđa. They can tell many stories. And embracing contestation might be the most natural and probably also the most successful way to their effective preservation. With this, I thank you for your attention and I give the floor to Emilia.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, me as well. One main characteristics of our duo with Aneta is that one of us is constantly questioning, sometimes even confronting each other's ideas, and that is exactly what I will do now. And because my role is to take theory to practice, I will take one of the last Aneta's statements that working out dissonance is possible to the next series of important questions. How do we do it exactly? How do we pick an approach? Do we want to exhaust dissonance or do we want to keep it active in time for some reason? Can dissonance be a cultural value? These are actually questions that have bothered me for some time, and I will now share my recent thoughts about them with you. The notion of dissonant heritage can be regarded as one in a series of results of a considerable evolution of heritage notion itself. In the beginning of 21st century, namely Professor Krstev, who spoke before, pointed out that the concept of heritage is constantly evolving and expanding. Heritage has gone way beyond the singular property to whole territories, so it has expanded its territorial scope. We are now more and more speaking about intangible heritage alongside the well-known tangible one, and aspects such as traditions, customs, local cuisine, etc. are upgrading and completing the overall idea of cultural heritage. Heritage has also expanded its types to add nuance, such as cultural roots and cultural landscapes. And it also expanded its temporal scope. And if we now scroll down UNESCO's World Heritage List, we will find out that it already contains examples from the late 20th century as well. And this evolution completely supports and is in tune with the positive narrative of heritage, in which it is, as Aneta said, regarded as indisputable public good and a testimony of cultural achievements. But parallel, however, I'm quite interested in the fact that this expansion of cultural heritage notion has reached such a point that it includes such types that come into conflict with the core, so to say, classical idea of heritage. The world has realized that heritage can also have different negative forms that come from the past and have a great effect in the present. These are, for example, the traces of the World War II that we now keep as anti-achievements and warnings for the future. Exactly with such purpose, the Nazi concentration camp is protected in Auschwitz, is protected at the highest possible level, the world one. And is nowadays, by the way, turned into a highly visited museum, as you all know. The same goes for the half-destroyed exhibition building that was the only surviving structure in Hiroshima after the atomic bomb explosion. And it is also recognized as world important and turned into a peace memorial and maintained exactly as it was right after the explosion. Auschwitz Camp and Hiroshima Memorial Park are a relatively new group in cultural heritage notion. The group of traces with negative, so to say, connotations. They are associated with indisputable human mistakes that we equally want to preserve as the ones of the indisputable human achievements. It is interesting, though, that these same false traces were once controversial themselves. Right in the sense described by Tunbridge and Ashworth, they were all argued over whether to keep them or destroy them. Today, however, they are already uncontested as culturally important documents. Their dissonance seems exhausted, maybe. It has been worked out already, maybe. And they are placed within the widely accepted heritage narrative. And yes, here is where I don't quite agree with Aneta that Auschwitz is still dissonant heritage today, for example. And if, of course, we do not question the World Heritage List itself. And then there is the emerging new group of the actively nowadays dissonant or still contested heritage sites, which are even more interesting because they're still at odds with the principal notion of cultural heritage. Some of them are existing cultural sites that are becoming controversial due to a change in public opinion about their significance, as is the case with the England's colonial figures. Others are relatively fresh, so to say, traces of the recently bygone 20th century. There is a serious doubt if they deserve to be recognized as cultural heritage at all. These are mostly representative of post-war architectural modernism, as we saw, socialist realism and socialist monuments, which are denounced, as we heard from Aneta, as ugly or utopian or totalitarian, and sometimes more than one at a time. So how can we work out the dissonance here? An interesting example I would use in this group is the Palace of Culture and Science that was discussed yesterday in Warsaw, representing the revolutionary change in the social system of the former Eastern Bloc countries, and how this change led to the rethinking of the legacy of the rejected regimes there. In the 1920s, there was a strong wave for demolishing the palace, as we know, the unwanted Soviet present. But instead, in 2007, it was listed as cultural heritage and became one of the city's must-see tourist attractions. Is it an evolutionary result? I'm not quite sure, because on one hand, such status would be unthinkable at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. On the other hand, even though the palace has become a heavily visited tourist site and queues for tickets are common here, there is still no public consensus about it. Here, dissonance seems not to be calmed down. It is still on and off and stirs public emotions, especially at election times, but it is remarkable how the demolition threat is being used for commercial purposes, for example. Creative indeed. And in Bulgaria, we are set behind, and we had our first dissonant site protected only half a year ago. But on the way to there, we hastily destroyed two other remarkable examples of contested heritage. The mausoleum of Georgi Dimitrov, whose empty spot, by the way, is still called the place of the mausoleum, and the monument 1,300 years of Bulgaria that was replaced by a lion in front of the National Palace of Culture, as you may already know. It seems that we're still trying to come to terms with our past, and here comes a challenging new suggestion in heritage conservation. Is it possible to look at dissonance as a particular new kind of value, cultural value, specific to the times that we live in now? Can it be a tool for better understanding our own historical development, with the whole palette of social contradictions and conflicts encoded in it? My answer, as you may guess, is yes, and I believe I have three key supporters. First would be the ICOMOS Declaration on Human Rights and Cultural Heritage that underlines, I quote, "The right to cultural heritage is an integral part of human rights, and that part of this right is the right to better understand one's heritage and that of others." The second will be the Council of Europe's Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society that points out that Europe's common heritage consists both of, quote, ideals, principles, and values derived from the experience gained through progress, but also of past conflicts. Last but not least comes the agonistic memory approach by Anna Chentubul that represents the past as a social-political struggle for dominance in which the other is seen as an opponent but not as an enemy. It does not try to create a single overarching narrative of the past, but instead acknowledges a variety of contrasting memories, allows multiple perspectives, and promotes dialogue in open-ended terms without the binding aspiration for consensus. Applying such approach in heritage conservation together with the messages of the previous key international doctrines transforms, I believe, heritage dissonance from unwanted memory to be deleted into a valuable source of self-awareness and evolution advice, even. This is what both of us with Aneta tried to prove for Buzluđa Monument in its conservation and management plan that is about to come out soon. But here is another short series of important questions. Now, if we assume that dissonance can be a cultural value, most logically, we should ask, how can we protect this value? First major problem would be that no heritage law, at least as far as I'm concerned, recognizes dissonance as heritage or a heritage asset, let's say. Then, do we need a new heritage category to place it along with the existing ones? And is listing a key at all for dissonance? I will give two quick Bulgarian examples. In the so-called first socialist town in Bulgaria, Dimitrovgrad, which has a lot in common with Nova Huta, as we will shortly see, we can find politically contested aspects for which the town was the perfect, and still is, a perfect participator in a cultural route of the Council of Europe called Atrium, or Architecture of Totalitarian Regimes in Urban Management, together with 16 other South European cities. But the contested aspects here did not in any way diminish the urban and social achievements that actually justified listing two of the town's urban ensembles as national heritage, and it is already in the list. So Dimitrovgrad is currently valuable despite its dissonance. While in the case of Buzluja, we have a completely different story. It is valuable because it is dissonant in way too many levels. It is an authentic document for several consecutive cultural periods, and it can tell, as we heard, many stories. Here, contestation should be exactly the key for heritage interpretation and, at the end, successful preservation. And mentioning authenticity, it should be noted that in this par excellence Bulgarian contested site, even the notion of authenticity is seriously challenged, because distractions become bearers of cultural significance and value assets. And at the end, contrary to the evolution in heritage notion that I started with, I will end with a concept that has not changed, I believe, through the years. And this is the concept that each site, each heritage site is unique and needs particular analysis and debate, in our case, whether, how exactly, and to what extent it is dissonant. Actually, I believe we must regard dissonance as cultural significant asset. And it is obvious that dissonance cannot be announced as a value in general. And for all sites that it appears in, it needs to be properly defined in the cultural significant assessment of each site, because it will most likely play a different role in each case. So we should each time and case by case handle dissonance with care. And with this final slide that I managed to fix, we thank you for your attention.